I'm Lena, 28 years old, and everything changed when I accidentally received a family group chat message that was meant to exclude me. The notification popped up on my phone at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday while I was reviewing quarterly reports in my cramped downtown office. Can't wait for Hawaii. The presidential suite at Mauna Kea is going to be incredible. So glad we kept this adults only. No drama. The message was from my sister Ilara, sent to a group called Whitlow Hawaii Crew that included my parents Gareth and Marina, my brother Dorian, and their spouses. My name wasn't on the list, but somehow the message had found its way to me anyway. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that subscribe button and join me as I share how discovering my family's secret vacation led to the most expensive lesson they ever learned. Growing up as the youngest, Whitlow meant understanding early that love came with conditions, and financial support came with strings that could be yanked away at any moment. My parents, Gareth and Marina, had built their identities around being successful providers, but their generosity was never equally distributed among their 3 children. Dorian, the eldest at 34, had received a full ride to law school courtesy of mom and dad, plus a $150,000 down payment on his house in Lincoln Park. Ilara, 31, got her MBA funded entirely by the family, along with a $200,000 wedding that was featured in Chicago Magazine. When my turn came for college, the well had apparently run dry. Character building, Dad called it. You need to learn the value of hard work, Mom explained as I signed my 4th student loan document. The pattern had continued long after graduation. Every major family vacation, every milestone celebration, every holiday gathering seemed to require a financial contribution that somehow always exceeded what I could reasonably afford on my nonprofit salary. When I couldn't make Dorian's destination bachelor party in Cabo, it became a family joke about Lena's priorities. When I skipped Ilara's anniversary cruise because the $3,000 cost would have wiped out my savings, I was labeled as unsupportive. The family dynamic had crystallized around my role as the struggling younger sibling who needed tough love to succeed, while Dorian and Ilara basked in parental support that seemed limitless. For years, I had accepted this dynamic because I believed their narrative about my financial irresponsibility. I was the one who had chosen a low-paying job at a domestic violence shelter instead of something practical. I was the one who insisted on living in expensive downtown apartments instead of moving back home. I was the one who spent money on therapy and art classes instead of building a proper emergency fund. Every family gathering included subtle reminders about my choices, delivered with the kind of loving concern that made it impossible to argue against. "We just want what's best for you, honey," Marina would say after suggesting I consider a more stable career path. "You're so smart, but you need to think more practically about your future." What they didn't know was that 6 months earlier, my life had taken a dramatic turn that I hadn't shared with anyone in my family. The mobile app I had been developing in my spare time for 3 years, designed to connect to survivors of domestic violence with resources and support networks, had caught the attention of a venture capital firm specializing in social impact technology. After months of presentations, negotiations, and due diligence, I had signed a term sheet for $2.3 million in seed funding. My nonprofit salary was about to become irrelevant, but I had kept the news to myself, partly out of superstition, and partly because I wanted to prove I could succeed without their validation or support. The Hawaii group chat message sat on my phone like a splinter I couldn't remove. I screenshot it and stared at the words over and over, trying to understand how my own family could plan a major vacation and deliberately exclude me without a single conversation about it. The casual tone of Ilara's message suggested this had been in the works for weeks, maybe months. The mention of a presidential suite at one of Hawaii's most expensive resorts indicated they were planning to spend serious money, the kind of money they had always claimed was too tight to help with my student loans or emergency expenses. I spent the rest of that afternoon researching the Mauna Kea Beach Hotel, discovering that their presidential suite ran $12,000 per night with a 7-night minimum stay during peak season. The photos showed expansive ocean views, private beach access, and amenities that read like a luxury lifestyle magazine spread. For a family that had lectured me for years about fiscal responsibility and the importance of living within one's means, they were planning a vacation that would cost more than my annual salary at the shelter. The disconnect between their words and their actions was so stark it felt like discovering my entire childhood had been based on a lie. That evening, I tried calling my mother under the pretense of a casual check-in, hoping she might mention the Hawaii trip and give me a chance to address the exclusion directly. Instead, she spent 20 minutes detailing Dorian's latest promotion and Ilara's new house hunting adventures, never once mentioning travel plans or family gatherings. When I finally asked if there was anything exciting coming up for the family, she paused just long enough to make me wonder if she knew I had seen the message. "Nothing major," she said finally. "Just the usual work and family stuff. Maybe we'll plan something fun for the holidays." The lie sat between us through the remainder of our conversation, a confirmation that my exclusion was intentional and coordinated. As I hung up the phone, I realized that the family dynamic I had spent years accepting and internalizing wasn't just unfair. It was deliberately constructed to keep me in a position of financial and emotional dependence. They needed me to be the struggling sister, the cautionary tale, the one who validated their choices by serving as an example of what happened when you didn't follow their prescribed path to success. The next morning, I woke up with the kind of clarity that only comes after a sleepless night of connecting dots you'd been deliberately ignoring for years. I made coffee in my tiny kitchen and opened my laptop, intending to work on investor presentations, but instead found myself logging into my credit monitoring app for the first time in months. What I discovered made my hands shake so violently I had to set down my mug to avoid spilling hot coffee across my keyboard. There were 3 credit inquiries from the past 6 months that I hadn't authorized, all linked to travel-related expenses, and my credit utilization was showing at 47% when I knew my personal cards were barely used. The deeper I dug into my credit report, the more devastating the picture became. My parents had been listed as authorized users on my business credit line since I'd started the company 2 years ago, a decision I'd made during a particularly vulnerable moment when Marina had convinced me that family support meant sharing financial responsibility. "You're so young to be taking on business debt alone," she had said. "Let us be there for you in case something goes wrong." What I hadn't realized was that their access wasn't limited to emergencies, and they certainly hadn't considered my knowledge or consent necessary for their financial decisions. The unauthorized charges painted a picture of casual betrayal that extended far beyond the Hawaii revelation. A $4,200 charge to a luxury hotel in Napa Valley from March that coincided with Dorian and Naomi's anniversary weekend. A $1,800 payment to a high-end restaurant in River North that matched the date of Alara's promotion dinner I hadn't been invited to. Smaller charges too. Hundreds of dollars here and there for experiences and luxuries that my family had enjoyed while lecturing me about fiscal responsibility and the importance of living within my means. When I called Marina that afternoon, I could hear the defensiveness in her voice before I even finished explaining why I was calling. "Those were legitimate business expenses," she said, her tone taking on the patient condescension I remembered from childhood arguments. "You gave us access for family emergencies, and family milestones count as emergencies in my book. Besides, you'll be able to pay it all back once your little app thing takes off." The dismissive way she referred to my company, my life's work, as a little app thing crystallized everything I needed to know about how my family viewed my success and autonomy. The conversation deteriorated quickly when I mentioned discovering the Hawaii group chat. Marina's response was swift and brutal in its casual cruelty. "Oh, honey, we didn't think you'd be able to afford something like that right now. The resort we picked is quite expensive, and we know money's been tight for you. We were trying to spare you the embarrassment of having to decline another family event." Her words were delivered with the kind of fake sweetness that made them cut deeper than outright hostility would have. "We'll plan something more budget-friendly next time so you can join us." I asked her directly how much they were planning to spend on this budget-conscious vacation that was too expensive for me to attend. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped, then Marina sighed with the weariness of someone being forced to explain something obvious to a child. "The presidential suite is $12,000 per night for 10 nights, plus activities and dining, so probably around $200,000 total for everyone. But Lena, you have to understand, this is a once-in-a-lifetime experience for the family. Dorian just made senior partner, Alara's company went public, and your father and I wanted to celebrate our children's success." The phrase, "our children's success," hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I wasn't included in the celebration because my success wasn't real to them, wasn't worthy of acknowledgement or commemoration. My years of graduate school, my work at the shelter, my app development, my recent funding round, none of it registered as legitimate achievement in their accounting of family accomplishments. I was still the charity case, the one who needed protection from financial realities, too complex for my simple understanding of money and responsibility. After ending the call with Marina, I sat in my office staring at my computer screen, feeling something shift inside me that I couldn't immediately name. It wasn't anger exactly, though anger was certainly part of it. It was more like the moment when you finally understand a magic trick that has been fooling you for years. A combination of admiration for the cleverness and fury at having been the target. My family had constructed an elaborate narrative about my financial incompetence that justified their behavior, while simultaneously ensuring I remained dependent on their approval and support. I spent the rest of the afternoon documenting every unauthorized charge, every manipulative conversation, every instance where my family had used their financial advantage to control and diminish me. The pattern was so consistent, it felt deliberate, which I supposed it was. They needed me to be struggling so they could feel successful by comparison. They needed me to be excluded so they could feel special by inclusion. They needed me to be grateful for scraps so they could feel generous while hoarding the real resources for themselves. The business credit line they had been using so casually was tied to my company's operating account, the same account that now held $2.3 million in investor funding. They had no idea that their emergency access gave them the ability to authorize charges against one of the largest business accounts they would ever encounter. As I scrolled through the credit management portal, I realized that I was still listed as the primary contact for any charges over $50,000, which meant any resort bookings, any large vacation expenses, any presidential suite reservations would require my explicit approval. That evening, Julian called to discuss our investor timeline and mentioned seeing some unusual account activity during his routine financial review. "There's an $89,000 pending authorization on the business line," he said. "Some kind of resort booking in Hawaii. I figured you'd want to handle it personally since it's flagged as requiring primary account holder approval." I told him I'd look into it, my heart racing as the pieces fell into place. They hadn't just used my credit to book their exclusive family vacation. They had done it in a way that gave me complete control over whether the payment would actually go through. As I hung up with Julian, I found myself smiling for the first time in days. My family had spent years teaching me about consequences and responsibility, about the importance of understanding that actions have prices that must be paid. They had drilled into me the value of fiscal accountability and the necessity of living within one's means. Tomorrow, they would leave for Hawaii, completely confident that their financial manipulation had once again worked in their favor. They had no idea that they were about to receive the most expensive education of their lives and that I would be the one teaching it. The next 3 days passed like a fever dream of discovery and planning. Every time I thought I had uncovered the full extent of my family's financial manipulation, another layer revealed itself. I spent my mornings at the office trying to maintain some semblance of normal productivity, while my afternoons dissolved into deep dives through bank statements, credit reports, and business account histories that painted an increasingly damning picture of systematic betrayal spanning nearly 2 years. The Hawaii booking was just the tip of the iceberg. Once I knew what to look for, the pattern became unmistakable. A $15,000 charge for Ilara's kitchen renovation that had been described to me as a family emergency loan but had never been repaid. A $8,500 payment for Dorian's law firm retreat that somehow qualified as a business expense on my company's account. Dozens of smaller charges for dinners, shopping trips, and entertainment that my family had enjoyed while simultaneously lecturing me about budgeting and financial discipline. What made the betrayal particularly sophisticated was how they had structured the deception. The charges were always categorized as legitimate business expenses or family emergencies, creating a paper trail that would be difficult to challenge legally while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. Marina had even gone so far as to text me thank you messages after some of the larger charges, framing them as grateful acknowledgments of my generous support rather than admissions of unauthorized use of my credit. I called my business attorney, Priya Nand, under the guise of routine compliance questions, but gradually steered the conversation toward hypothetical scenarios involving unauthorized use of business credit by family members. Her response was swift and unambiguous. If someone uses business credit without proper authorization, even if they're listed as authorized users, it constitutes fraud if the charges aren't for legitimate business purposes. The fact that its family doesn't provide legal protection, and you have every right to dispute the charges and reverse any payments. The conversation with Priya crystallized something that had been building in my mind since discovering the Hawaii booking. My family had spent years positioning themselves as my financial superiors, people whose judgment about money was inherently more trustworthy than my own. They had used this manufactured authority to manipulate me into giving them access to my resources, while simultaneously excluding me from the benefits of their own wealth. The Hawaii trip represented the pinnacle of this dynamic. Using my money to fund a luxury vacation, I wasn't allowed to attend because I was supposedly too poor to afford it. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I calculated my actual net worth. Between my salary, my savings, my company's current valuation, and the investor funding, I was worth approximately $3.2 million on paper. My liquid assets alone exceeded what my parents had in their retirement accounts, a fact I knew because they had shared those numbers with me repeatedly over the years while explaining why they couldn't help with my student loans. The financial hierarchy that had defined our family relationships was completely inverted from reality, which explained why they worked so hard to maintain the illusion of my incompetence. Julian called me Friday morning with an update that made my stomach drop and my pulse quicken simultaneously. "They're requesting payment authorization for the Hawaii booking," he said. "The resort contacted our business accounting department directly asking for confirmation of the $89,000 charge. Apparently, the primary cardholder needs to approve any single transaction over $50,000, and they're leaving tomorrow, so they need confirmation today. Do you want me to handle it, or should I transfer them to you?" I asked Julian to transfer the call to my direct line, my hands trembling slightly as I waited for the connection. The voice that came through was professionally cheerful with a slight French accent. "Ms. Whitlow, this is Camille Duval, guest services manager at Mauna Kea Beach Hotel. We have your family checking in tomorrow for a 10-day stay in our presidential suite, and we need to confirm payment authorization for the total amount of $89,247, including accommodations, dining package, and resort activities." The number was even higher than I had calculated, a sum that represented more than 2 years of my old nonprofit salary. I told Camille that I needed to review the booking details and would call back within 2 hours with authorization or cancellation instructions. She assured me that was perfectly acceptable and provided her direct number for my convenience. After hanging up, I sat in my office chair and allowed myself to fully comprehend what was about to happen. My family was currently packing for their dream vacation, completely confident that their financial manipulation had once again worked in their favor. They had no idea that their entire trip depended on my approval, or that I had spent the past week documenting their years of systematic fraud and emotional abuse. The next hour was spent in careful preparation. I documented every unauthorized charge with screenshots and bank statements. I printed copies of all relevant conversations and text messages that demonstrated their pattern of financial manipulation. I researched the legal implications of payment reversal and confirmed with Priya that I was within my rights to deny authorization for charges that weren't legitimate business expenses. Most importantly, I prepared myself emotionally for what was about to become the most expensive confrontation in my family's history. At 2:30 p.m., exactly 24 hours before my family's scheduled check-in at Mauna Kea Beach Hotel, I called Camille Duval back. The conversation was brief and professionally straightforward. I explained that after reviewing the charges, I could not authorize payment for personal vacation expenses on a business credit line, and that I was formally disputing the entire amount as unauthorized use of company funds. Camille was extremely understanding and informed me that the reservation would be canceled immediately, with all deposits returned to the original payment method within 3 to 5 business days. I asked Camille to send me written confirmation of the cancellation, along with a detailed breakdown of what services had been prepaid and what refund timeline the family could expect. She agreed to email everything within the hour and mentioned that standard policy required them to notify the guests immediately about payment issues and reservation cancellations. The family would be informed of the cancellation before they left for the airport, giving them enough time to make alternative arrangements if they chose to fund the trip through legitimate means. As I hung up the phone, I realized that the scared, manipulated young woman who had been trained to accept financial crumbs and emotional manipulation was gone. In her place was someone who understood her own worth and refused to subsidize the luxury lifestyles of people who had systematically undermined her confidence and independence. My family was about to learn that their years of financial lessons had been absorbed and understood, just not in the way they had intended. They had taught me about consequences and accountability, about the importance of living within one's means and taking responsibility for one's choices. Tomorrow, they would discover that those lessons applied to everyone, including them. The next few hours would determine whether they had learned anything from their years of teaching, or whether they still believed that financial responsibility was a burden that only applied to other people. Either way, the dynamic that had defined our relationships for the past decade was about to change permanently, and for the first time in my life, I would be the one setting the terms. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of artificial calm that precedes earthquakes. I woke up at 6 a.m. knowing that somewhere across the city, my family was loading suitcases into cars and finalizing last-minute travel preparations for a vacation that no longer existed. Their flight to Kona was scheduled for 2:15 p.m., which meant they would discover the cancellation sometime in the next few hours when they received Camille's notification email or attempted to confirm their reservation details with the resort. I made coffee and opened my laptop, navigating to Instagram and Facebook with the morbid curiosity of someone watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. Elara had posted a series of stories the night before, expensive luggage arranged artfully in her walk-in closet, a flat lay of designer swimwear and resort wear, a boomerang video of her and Kenji clinking champagne glasses with the caption, T-12 hours until paradise. The casual display of wealth and excitement felt obscene, knowing that every dollar they were planning to spend had been stolen from my business account without my knowledge or consent. My phone buzzed at 8:47 a.m. with the first sign that my carefully orchestrated plan was beginning to take effect. A text from Marina, sent to the family group chat that I wasn't supposed to be part of but somehow still received. Has anyone talked to the resort this morning? We got a weird email about payment issues, but it must be a mistake. The message was followed immediately by another from Dorian. I'll call them when I get to the airport. Probably just a system glitch. Their confidence was absolute. Their assumption that any financial issue could be easily resolved a testament to how thoroughly they had insulated themselves from real consequences. I spent the morning in my office, ostensibly working on investor presentations, but actually refreshing social media and checking my phone every few minutes for updates. Julian had agreed to field any calls that came through the business line, partly to protect me from having to lie directly to my family, and partly because he wanted to witness firsthand what he called the most epic financial reckoning in startup history. His enthusiasm for the situation made me feel slightly less guilty about the nuclear option I had chosen. At 11:23 a.m., my phone exploded with activity. 6 missed calls from Marina, 4 from Gareth, 3 from Dorian, and 2 from Elara, all within the span of 10 minutes. The voicemails that followed painted a picture of escalating panic and disbelief. Marina's first message was calm but confused. Lena, honey, we're having some kind of mix-up with the resort. Can you call me back as soon as possible? Dorian's message was more direct. Lena, the hotel is saying our reservation was canceled due to payment issues. This has to be a mistake. Call me immediately. By the 4th voicemail, the tone had shifted dramatically. Gareth's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. Lena, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but we have a plane to catch in 3 hours and a family vacation that's been planned for months. Fix this now. Elara's final message was the most revealing. Lena, if you think you can sabotage our family trip because you're jealous about not being invited, you're making a huge mistake. Dad's talking about cutting you off completely if you don't resolve this immediately. The threat of being cut off would have terrified me 6 months ago. The old Lena would have panicked at the thought of losing family support and would have called the resort immediately to authorize the payment, probably apologizing profusely for the inconvenience while accepting full blame for the misunderstanding. But the new Lena, the one sitting in her office with $2.3 million in funding and a growing business, felt nothing but contempt for the manipulation tactics that had controlled her for so long. I waited until 12:15 p.m. to call Marina back, timing the conversation to occur exactly 2 hours before their flight departure, when the pressure would be maximum, but alternatives would still be theoretically possible. Her voice when she answered was strained with the kind of panic that comes from watching carefully laid plans disintegrate without explanation. Lena, thank God. We need you to call the resort immediately and fix whatever went wrong with the payment. I let her explain the entire situation, as if I knew nothing about it, listening to her describe the shocking discovery that their luxury vacation had been canceled due to unauthorized use of business credit. Her voice took on the patient tone she used when explaining simple concepts to confused children. I know you gave us permission to use the business account for family emergencies, and this is definitely a family emergency now. We just need you to call them and confirm that the charges were authorized. The moment felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that the next words out of my mouth would permanently alter every relationship in my family. I took a deep breath and delivered the line I had been rehearsing for days. Mom, I can't authorize payment for a personal vacation on a business credit line. That would be fraud, and I'm not comfortable breaking the law to fund a trip I wasn't invited to join. The silence that followed was so complete, I wondered if the call had dropped. When Marina finally spoke, her voice had transformed into something I had never heard before, a combination of disbelief and raw fury. Are you telling me that you deliberately sabotaged our family vacation because your feelings were hurt about not being included? The question hung between us like a loaded weapon, and I realized that this was the moment where our relationship would either evolve or explode. I explained calmly that I had discovered months of unauthorized charges on my business account, that I had documented every instance of financial manipulation, and that the Hawaii booking was simply the final straw in a pattern of systematic fraud that I could no longer ignore. Marina's response was immediate and vicious. You ungrateful little bitch. After everything we've done for you, After all the money we've spent on your education and your problems, this is how you repay us." The conversation deteriorated rapidly from there, with Marina cycling through threats, guilt trips, and finally desperate bargaining, as the reality of their situation became undeniable. She offered to pay me back for the Hawaii trip if I would call the resort and restore the reservation. She promised that they would remove themselves from my business accounts and never use them again. She even suggested that I could join them on the trip if I would just authorize the payment and book my own room. I ended the call at 1:45 p.m., 30 minutes before their scheduled departure, with the knowledge that my family was currently sitting in O'Hare International Airport, facing the choice between spending $89,000 of their own money on a last-minute vacation or accepting that their years of financial manipulation had finally caught up with them. Either way, the lesson was clear. The days of treating me as their personal ATM while excluding me from the benefits were permanently over. The final text message of the day came from Dorian at 3:22 p.m., sent from the airport. "Congratulations, Lena. You've officially destroyed our family over money. I hope it was worth it." I screenshot the message and saved it to my growing file of family communications, then muted all their numbers and returned to work. The old family dynamic was dead, and whatever emerged from its ashes would have to be built on a foundation of mutual respect rather than financial manipulation and emotional abuse. The silence that followed my family's aborted Hawaii departure lasted exactly 72 hours before the storm hit, with unprecedented fury. Monday morning brought a cascade of missed calls, furious emails, and increasingly desperate text messages as the reality of their situation solidified into something they could no longer dismiss or manipulate away. But it was Tuesday afternoon when I received the call that marked the true beginning of their reckoning and my emergence as someone they had never seen before. Julian knocked on my office door at 2:34 p.m. with an expression that mixed professional concern with barely suppressed amusement. "There's a woman online when claiming to be your mother, demanding to speak with whoever authorized the payment reversal for some resort booking. She's been on hold for 20 minutes and is threatening legal action against the company." I had been expecting this call since Saturday, knowing that my family's initial shock would eventually crystallize into the kind of coordinated assault they had perfected over years of manipulating me into submission. I took the call in my office with Julian listening on speaker, a decision that would prove crucial for the documentation we would need later. Marina's voice when the line connected was unlike anything I had ever heard from her. Stripped of its usual calculated sweetness and reduced to raw desperation barely held in check. "Lena, you need to fix this immediately. Your father had a panic attack yesterday, thinking about the money we've lost, and Yalara hasn't stopped crying since we got home from the airport." The image of my family's distress should have triggered the guilt and compliance that had defined my responses for 28 years. Instead, I felt something closer to clinical interest as I watched their emotional manipulation tactics play out exactly as I had predicted. "Mom, I explained this on Saturday. I can't authorize fraudulent charges on a business account. If you want to take a family vacation, you'll need to use your own money." Marina's composure cracked completely at my refusal to accept responsibility for their crisis. "Our own money? Lena, that resort booking was $89,000. Do you have any idea what that represents to our family? Your father is talking about taking out a second mortgage just to cover the deposits we lost." The irony of her complaint was breathtaking in its completeness. My family, who had spent years lecturing me about fiscal responsibility while stealing from my accounts, was now facing the consequences of living beyond their means. What followed was a 43-minute conversation that Julian later described as a masterclass in psychological warfare, disguised as family concern. Marina cycled through every manipulation tactic in her considerable arsenal: threats about my father's health, predictions about family relationships that would never recover, detailed descriptions of how my siblings' children would grow up knowing their aunt as the person who destroyed their parents' happiness. Each escalation was met with calm repetition of the same basic facts. Unauthorized use of business credit constitutes fraud. I had documented evidence of systematic financial manipulation, and their vacation planning was not my responsibility. The turning point came when Marina played what she clearly believed was her nuclear option. "Fine, Lena, if this is how you want to handle family business, your father and I are prepared to disown you completely. No more Christmas, no more birthdays, no more family events of any kind. You'll be completely cut off from everyone who loves you." The threat that would have reduced me to begging just months earlier now felt like a liberation I hadn't known I needed. I told Marina that I accepted her terms and looked forward to building relationships with people who didn't require me to fund their lifestyles in exchange for basic familial affection. The silence that followed my response lasted so long that Julian gestured to ask if the call had dropped. When Marina finally spoke again, her voice had shifted into something I had never heard before, genuine fear. "You can't be serious! Lena, where are your family? This is just about money." The phrase, "just about money," crystallized everything that needed to be said about our relationship dynamic. "No, Mom, this isn't just about money. This is about respect, honesty, and treating me like an adult instead of a resource to be exploited. The money was just how you expressed your contempt." I explained that I had spent the weekend reviewing every financial interaction we'd had over the past 5 years, and had calculated that they had taken approximately $340,000 from my accounts, without my knowledge or consent. Marina's response revealed the depth of her delusion about our family's financial reality. "That money was investments in your future, Lena. Everything we spent was to help you succeed." When I asked her to explain how funding Dorian's law firm retreat and Alara's kitchen renovation constituted investments in my future, she fell back on the circular logic that had defined our relationship for years. Family money was community money, except when it came to excluding me from family benefits. The conversation ended when I informed Marina that I had already contacted my attorney about pursuing criminal fraud charges against anyone who had used my business accounts for personal expenses. The threat wasn't entirely serious. I had no intention of actually pressing charges against my family, but it served to communicate that the power dynamic she had spent decades constructing was permanently inverted. "If you want to maintain any relationship with me going forward, you'll remove yourselves from all my financial accounts and commit to funding your own lifestyle choices." Thursday brought the phone call I had been both dreading and anticipating since Saturday. Gareth's voice when I answered was barely recognizable, stripped of the confident authority that had intimidated me throughout my childhood and reduced to something approaching genuine humility. "Lena, we need to talk. Your mother told me about your conversation, and I think there might be some misunderstandings we need to clear up." The word misunderstandings triggered a reaction in me that surprised both of us with its intensity. "There's no misunderstanding, Dad. You've been stealing from me for 2 years while simultaneously treating me like I'm too incompetent to manage my own finances. The only misunderstanding was my belief that you actually respected me as an adult." Gareth's attempt to minimize the situation fell apart quickly when confronted with the documented evidence I had compiled. What followed was the most honest conversation my father and I had ever had, largely because his usual deflection tactics were useless when confronted with bank statements and credit reports. He admitted that the family had become dependent on my generosity, but insisted that their intentions had always been to help me succeed. When I pointed out that excluding me from the benefits while extracting the costs was the opposite of help, he fell silent for nearly 2 minutes. The call ended with Gareth making an offer that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier: full repayment of all unauthorized charges, removal from all my accounts, and a family meeting to reset our relationships on a more appropriate foundation. I told him I would consider the proposal, but needed time to evaluate whether any relationship with them was worth the emotional cost. For the first time in my life, my father accepted my terms without argument, negotiation, or emotional manipulation. Friday afternoon brought the final piece of my family's capitulation. Ilara called from her car, crying so hard that I could barely understand her words through the sobbing. Between gasps, she managed to convey that she had spent the week calculating how much money they had taken from me and was horrified by the total. She begged for a chance to make amends and explained that losing our relationship would be worse than any financial consequences they might face. I listened to her emotional breakdown with the detached curiosity of someone watching a science experiment unfold. The sister who had excluded me from family events while funding them with my stolen money was now facing the reality that actions have consequences, even within families that had traditionally been insulated from accountability. When she finished crying, I told her the same thing I had told our parents: removal from my accounts, full repayment, and a fundamental restructuring of our relationship based on mutual respect rather than financial extraction. That evening, as I sat in my apartment reviewing the week's communications, I realized that my family's education was nearly complete. They had learned that their years of financial manipulation had consequences they couldn't manipulate away. They had discovered that my love and loyalty weren't unconditional resources they could exploit indefinitely. Most importantly, they had been forced to confront the reality that their treatment of me reflected their character, not mine. The scared, dependent young woman they had spent years creating was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to subsidize their delusions about family hierarchy. 6 months after what my family had started calling the Hawaii incident, I sat in my expanded office space overlooking downtown, reading an email from Marina that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. Lena, your father and I have finished liquidating our investment portfolio to repay the money we took from your accounts. The final transfer of $127,000 will complete the full restitution of $340,000, plus interest calculated at prime rate. We hope this demonstrates our commitment to rebuilding our relationship on the foundation you requested. The transformation in my family's behavior had been swift and comprehensive once they realized that their financial leverage over me was not only gone, but had been completely reversed. Gareth had spent 3 months working with a forensic accountant to document every unauthorized charge, every manipulative transaction, every instance where they had used my resources while excluding me from benefits. The final accounting revealed a pattern of systematic exploitation that even he couldn't rationalize, away with appeals to family loyalty or character building. More surprising than their financial capitulation was the emotional reckoning that had followed. Dorian had been the first to break ranks, calling me in February, with what he described as a long overdue apology for being a shitty brother. His voice carried a weight I had never heard before as he explained how watching me stand up to the family's financial manipulation had forced him to examine his own complicity in years of emotional abuse disguised as sibling rivalry. I always knew what we were doing was wrong, but it was easier to go along with it than to be the target myself. Elara's transformation had been even more dramatic. The sister who had spent years excluding me from family events while using my money to fund them had enrolled in therapy and was working through what her counselor had identified as learned patterns of emotional manipulation inherited from generational family trauma. Her insights about our family dynamic were surprisingly sophisticated. Mom and Dad needed someone to be the failure so they could feel successful by comparison. We all participated in keeping you in that role because it protected us from having to be the target. The family gathering they had planned for Gareth's 65th birthday in March had been a study in reverse power dynamics. Instead of the usual subtle digs about my lifestyle choices and financial decisions, the conversation revolved around their businesses, their successes, their plans for the future. I was consulted rather than lectured, included rather than tolerated. The change was so complete that I found myself slightly nostalgic for the familiar territory of their disapproval. What surprised me most was discovering that I wasn't the only family member who had been financially exploited over the years. My cousin Celine Hart reached out in April after hearing about the Hawaii situation through family gossip networks. Her story mirrored mine in disturbing detail. Years of unauthorized use of her credit for family emergencies, exclusion from events she had unknowingly funded, and a carefully maintained narrative about her financial irresponsibility that justified their behavior while undermining her confidence. Celine's revelation led to a broader family reckoning as other relatives came forward with their own stories of financial manipulation. Uncle Declan admitted that Gareth had been borrowing against his business for years without proper documentation. Aunt Moira revealed that Marina had been using her credit cards for luxury purchases while claiming temporary cash flow problems. The pattern of exploitation extended far beyond my immediate family and had been operating like a pyramid scheme with the older generation, extracting resources from younger members while maintaining their own lifestyle. The legal implications of their systematic fraud had been more serious than any of us initially realized. Attorney Priyanand had explained that the documented pattern of unauthorized credit use constituted criminal fraud that could result in felony charges if I chose to pursue them. While I had no intention of pressing criminal charges against my family, the legal leverage provided exactly the motivation they needed to take the situation seriously and commit to meaningful change. My business had thrived in ways that seemed almost poetic given the circumstances. New Horizon Tech Solutions had expanded into 3 new markets. Our client base had tripled, and we were preparing for a Series A funding round that would value the company at $15 million. Julian had been promoted to Chief Operating Officer, and we had hired a team of 12 employees who had no idea that their CEO had once been considered the family failure by people who were stealing her money to fund their own success. The personal transformation had been even more significant than the professional one. I was engaged to Marcus Chen, a software engineer I had met through our expanded business network, who treated me with the kind of consistent respect and admiration that my family had taught me not to expect. Our relationship was built on mutual support rather than power dynamics, shared goals rather than financial obligation, genuine affection rather than conditional approval, based on my ability to provide resources or absorb abuse. The final family gathering of the year was scheduled for Thanksgiving, an event that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Marina had called to extend the invitation with a humility that still felt foreign coming from her. "We know we have a lot of work to do to earn back your trust, and we understand if you're not ready to spend holidays with us yet. But we wanted you to know that you're welcome and wanted, with no expectations or obligations attached. I had agreed to attend, partly out of curiosity about how thoroughly their attitudes had changed, and partly because I wanted to introduce Marcus to the people who had shaped me through their absence of support. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was finally being welcomed into family events at the exact moment when their approval had become irrelevant to my happiness or success. The night before Thanksgiving, I sat in my home office responding to Marina's email about the final restitution payment. My response was brief and professional. Thank you for completing the repayment process. I look forward to seeing how our relationships continue to evolve as we move forward. I didn't mention forgiveness or reconciliation, not because I was holding grudges, but because those concepts felt beside the point. What mattered wasn't whether I forgave them for years of financial and emotional manipulation. What mattered was that they had been forced to confront the reality of their behavior and make meaningful changes to address the harm they had caused. They had learned that love couldn't be purchased with stolen money, that respect couldn't be demanded without being earned, and that family relationships required mutual consideration rather than hierarchical exploitation. As I closed my laptop and prepared for bed, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that accidental group chat message had revealed my family's true priorities. The scared, dependent young woman who had been trained to accept financial crumbs and emotional manipulation was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to negotiate down from it. My family's cruel joke about Hawaii had inadvertently given me the push I needed to claim my power and demand the respect I had always deserved. The most satisfying part wasn't their apologies or their financial restitution, though both were meaningful. The most satisfying part was knowing that I had built a life so rich and fulfilling that their approval was no longer necessary for my happiness. They could choose to be part of my success on terms of mutual respect, or they could choose to remain in the past with their manipulative dynamics and financial games. Either way, I would be fine, and for the first time in my life, they knew it too.